Abandoned infant discovered. Then the horror began. The foundling. The wind howled through the desolate streets as Officer Daniel Mercer navigated his patrol car down an empty alleyway. It was a quiet night in Millbrook, a town where nothing ever seemed to happen until tonight. The call had come in from a frantic passerby, claiming they had heard the piercing wails of a baby echoing from behind the old, abandoned St. Mark's orphanage. Daniel pulled up to the crumbling building, its boarded-up windows barely concealing the darkness within. A single streetlight flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement. He killed the engine and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The cries were louder now, raw and desperate. He followed the sound, his boots crunching against scattered debris. Behind the orphanage, nestled in the crook of a toppled wooden sign that once read "A Place for Hope," lay a bundle wrapped in a tattered gray blanket. The moment Daniel saw it, a chill crawled up his spine. The crying stopped abruptly. The silence felt unnatural. Kneeling, he reached for the bundle, peeling back the damp fabric. A tiny face emerged, pale, doll-like, with eyes too large for its head. They were completely black, endless voids that swallowed the dim light. Daniel recoiled, but the baby remained still, staring at him with an eerie intensity. Something about it was deeply wrong. But he couldn't just leave it there. Carefully, he scooped it up, feeling an odd, unnatural chill radiating from its fragile body. He cradled the infant against his chest, ignoring the instinctual dread coiling in his stomach. He had to get it to the hospital. But as he turned back toward his patrol car, he heard a whisper. A soft, insidious voice, curling through the air like smoke. "You shouldn't have taken it." Daniel spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. The alley was empty, just the wind slithering through the ruins. He quickened his pace, securing the baby in the passenger seat before sliding behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the thickening mist that had begun creeping in. As he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something unseen but undeniably there. Halfway to the hospital, the baby stirred. A small, raspy breath escaped its tiny lips. Then another. Its mouth opened, stretching unnaturally wide, revealing a row of needle-like teeth. Daniel slammed on the brakes. For a moment, there was silence. The baby was still, its expression eerily neutral. Then, in a voice that did not belong to an infant, it whispered, "You should have left me there." Part 2. The Awakening. Daniel sat frozen in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The baby, if it was even a baby, stared at him with those soulless black eyes, its mouth still slightly open, revealing those needle-like teeth. His breath came in shallow gasps. He had seen a lot of disturbing things in his years as a police officer, crime scenes, horrific accidents, but this was something else entirely. The radio crackled to life. "Unit 3 to 7, respond. Officer Mercer, do you copy?" Daniel hesitated, his eyes locked on the unmoving infant beside him. Then, with a shaking hand, he reached for the radio. "This is Mercer. I have a foundling. En route to Millbrook General." There was a pause. Then static. Then something else. A voice, distorted, wrong, whispered through the speaker. "You should turn back." Daniel's stomach twisted. That wasn't dispatch. He glanced back at the baby, half expecting its mouth to be moving, but it was still. Too still. It didn't blink. It didn't breathe. Then, as if sensing his thoughts, it took in a slow, deliberate breath. A guttural clicking sound came from deep within its throat. Daniel slammed the radio back into place and floored the gas. The town blurred past him in streaks of orange and white as he sped toward the hospital. His mind raced. He had to get someone else involved. A doctor, a specialist, someone who could explain what this thing was. As he reached the hospital parking lot, he swerved to a stop in the emergency drop-off zone. Before he could even unbuckle his seatbelt, the automatic doors burst open and a nurse rushed out. "You called about an abandoned infant," she asked, scanning the car. Daniel nodded quickly and reached for the bundle. But the moment his fingers brushed the fabric, an icy pain shot up his arm. He recoiled with a sharp gasp. The nurse frowned. "Officer? Are you okay?" Daniel didn't answer. He forced himself to grab the bundle again, ignoring the searing cold radiating from within. Lifting it carefully, he handed it over. The moment the nurse cradled the baby in her arms, the hospital lights flickered. A deep hum vibrated through the air, low and unnatural. The nurse stiffened. Her breath hitched. Then she screamed. The baby convulsed in her grip, its small limbs twisting at grotesque angles. Its skin darkened, veins bulging beneath the surface like writhing black tendrils. The nurse staggered back, her face contorted in horror. What is this?" Daniel grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the entrance. "Get inside. Now." The second they stepped into the hospital, the lights surged, bathing everything in a blinding white glare. The baby let out an ear-piercing shriek, so loud, so unnatural, it rattled the very air. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Silence. Daniel's ears rang. The nurse trembled beside him, clutching the now-still bundle. A doctor rushed toward them. "What the hell is going on?" Daniel could barely form the words. "Something's wrong with that baby." The doctor gestured to a nearby gurney. "Get it to the ICU. Now." Two orderlies appeared, taking the bundle and rushing it down the hall. The nurse, still pale, turned to Daniel. Where did you find it?" He swallowed hard. "Behind St. Mark's orphanage." The nurse's face drained of color. "The orphanage burned down 30 years ago," she whispered. Daniel felt his blood turn to ice. Before he could respond, a distant scream echoed from down the hall. Then another. Then the lights went out. To be continued. To be continued. Part 3. The Hospital Haunting. The hospital plunged into darkness. A thick, suffocating silence settled over the halls, broken only by the distant echoes of screams. The emergency backup lights flickered to life, casting eerie red glows along the corridors. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as he reached for his gun. Beside him, the nurse trembled, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. From down the hall, a wet, slithering sound echoed. Then a voice. Soft. Whispering. "It's awake." Daniel turned toward the ICU, where the orderlies had taken the baby. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. "Stay here," he told the nurse, though he doubted any place was truly safe now. Gun raised, he stepped into the dimly lit corridor. The scent of antiseptic mixed with something rotten, like meat left out too long in the sun. His boots squeaked against the linoleum as he moved forward, heart hammering with each step. The ICU doors stood slightly ajar, a single, flickering light casting jagged shadows against the walls. He pushed the doors open. Inside, the orderlies lay sprawled across the floor, their bodies twisted in unnatural angles. The gurney was overturned, the blanket that had once wrapped the baby discarded in a crumpled heap. The infant was gone. Something dripped from the ceiling. Daniel's gaze lifted. A dark stain spread across the tiles above, a slow-moving ink blot bleeding outward. And from within the stain something moved. A thin, spindly hand, too long, too wrong, emerged, fingers twitching as it clawed its way downward. Daniel staggered back, ball rising in his throat. Then he heard it. Laughter. High-pitched. Gurgling. And then the whisper. "You took me from home." The thing dropped. Daniel barely had time to react before it landed on all fours, its elongated limbs splayed at unnatural angles. It wasn't a baby anymore. It had grown. Its body was now that of a child, thin, emaciated, its skin stretched tight over its frame. Its face was the same, but its black, soulless eyes had widened, as if consuming more of its face. And its mouth, rows of jagged, needle-like teeth dripped with something thick and black. Daniel fired. The shot rang through the ICU, deafening in the enclosed space. The thing moved too fast. It scuttled across the floor, dodging the bullet with inhuman speed. Then it lunged. Daniel barely dodged as clawed fingers slashed the air where his throat had been. He stumbled back, crashing into a medical cart. Instruments clattered to the floor. The thing tilted its head, studying him with unnatural stillness. Then, slowly, its lips pulled into a grin, too wide, stretching almost to its ears. "You should have left me there." Then it melted into the shadows, vanishing into the vents above. Daniel scrambled to his feet, chest heaving. He turned, bolting back toward the entrance. The nurse was gone. The hallway was different now, longer, impossibly stretching into the distance. The walls pulsed, the overhead lights flickering in a slow, unnatural rhythm. Then, from somewhere deep within the hospital, the whispers began again. "You brought it here. Now it's awake." Daniel's breath hitched. He wasn't in a hospital anymore. He was somewhere else. And something was coming. Part 4. The Realm of the Forgotten. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps as he stared down the impossibly long hallway. The hospital had shifted, distorted into something wrong. The walls, once sterile white, were now gray and pulsing, almost organic, like breathing flesh stretched over a skeleton of steel and concrete. The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting unnatural shadows that seemed to slither along the floor. The air was thick with decay. The scent of something rotten clung to his skin, seeping into his lungs with every breath. He took a hesitant step forward, gun still clenched in his trembling hand. Then, from the far end of the corridor, a figure emerged. At first, it was small, a silhouette, hunched and unmoving. But as the flickering lights illuminated it, Daniel's stomach twisted. It was the child. The thing he had brought here. Only now it had grown again. It stood nearly 4 feet tall, its limbs stretched and elongated like a grotesque marionette. Its fingers, too many of them, twitched at its sides. Its head tilted slightly, as if listening, and then its mouth split open, revealing jagged, glistening teeth. "You took me from home." The voice slithered through the hallway, crawling beneath his skin. It wasn't coming from the child's mouth. It was everywhere, whispering from the walls, echoing from the vents, seeping from the very air around him. Daniel gritted his teeth, forcing himself to move. He had to get out. He had to find the nurse, someone. He turned, bolting toward the emergency exit. But the doors weren't there anymore. The hallway stretched endlessly, twisting upon itself in an impossible loop. No matter how far he ran, the corridor remained the same, stretching on like a nightmare with no escape. Then the whispers grew louder. "Do you remember St. Mark's?" Daniel skidded to a stop, his heart slamming against his ribs. St. Mark's Orphanage. The place where he had found the baby. He did remember it. But there was something more, something buried in the depths of his memory, clawing to be remembered. Then, all at once, the walls peeled away, dissolving into darkness. The hospital was gone, and Daniel was somewhere else. The orphanage. The scent of burning wood and damp earth filled his nose. He was outside now, standing before the ruins of St. Mark's Orphanage. But this wasn't how he had left it. The building was whole, restored to its former state. The old wooden doors creaked in the wind, and the stained glass windows shimmered under the pale moonlight. Daniel took a step forward, his boots crunching against the dead leaves that covered the ground. Then, from within the orphanage, a child's laughter rang out. Not the eerie, gurgling laughter of the thing he had brought here. This was different. It was familiar. His hands trembled as flashes of memory flickered through his mind, images of long-forgotten corridors, the sound of children's footsteps echoing through empty halls, the sharp sting of cold air against his skin. Daniel swallowed hard. He had been here before. And then, as if answering the realization, the orphanage doors slowly creaked open. He knew he shouldn't go inside, but he had no choice. With a deep breath, he stepped through the threshold. The moment he entered, the door slammed shut behind him, and the whispers began again. "Welcome home. To be continued. To be continued." Part 5. The Forgotten Child. The orphanage swallowed Daniel in darkness. The air was thick, damp, carrying the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. Blood? His footsteps echoed across the warped floorboards, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive silence. Then, a single lantern flickered to life down the hall, casting a sickly yellow glow. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. And then footsteps.
Light. Quick.
Bare feet against wood. A child's laughter rang through the hall, high-pitched and playful, but there was something wrong beneath it, something hollow, something hungry. Daniel tightened his grip on his gun and pressed forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He passed doors on either side of the hall, each one slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of something inside. A rusted crib, rocking slowly on its own. A child-sized figure standing motionless in the corner, its face obscured. A row of beds, their sheets pulled tight over lumps that shifted beneath the fabric. Daniel's throat tightened. He knew this place.
But why?
At the end of the hallway, another door creaked open. Beyond it, the faint sound of crying echoed in the darkness. Slowly, he stepped inside. The nursery. The room was filled with cribs, all lined neatly against the walls. The air was stale, heavy with dust and something foul. At the far end of the room, beneath a broken window, sat a single crib with a tattered gray blanket, the same blanket the infant had been wrapped in when he found it. And inside, something moved. Daniel approached cautiously, the hairs on his arms standing on end. With a deep breath, he reached forward and pulled back the blanket. There, curled into itself, was a small, withered figure. Its skin was gray, its body impossibly thin. It trembled, its frail arms wrapped around itself, as if trying to stay warm. Then it lifted its head, and Daniel saw its face. His own. A choked gasp escaped his throat as memories crashed into him like a tidal wave. He had been here before. Not as a police officer. As a child. The truth. St. Mark's hadn't just been an orphanage. It had been his orphanage. And he had been one of its forgotten children. The memories flooded back in fragments. Nights spent shivering in a cold, damp room. The whispers of something moving in the walls. The other children vanishing one by one. And then the fire. He had escaped. Or at least he had thought he had. "You left me here." The whisper curled around him like smoke. Daniel turned sharply. The child, the thing he had found in the alley, stood before him now, fully grown. It was him. And yet it wasn't. Its eyes, those hollow, black voids, bored into him. Its mouth stretched into a jagged, unnatural grin. "You left me to burn." Daniel staggered back, his mind spinning. This wasn't a child. It was him. Or rather, what he had left behind. The part of him that had never escaped. The part that had died in the fire. The orphanage trembled around him. The walls cracked and splintered. Flames erupted from the floor, looking hungrily at the shadows. "You shouldn't have come back." The figure lunged. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. And then, darkness. The awakening. When he opened his eyes, he was back in his patrol car. The hospital was gone. The orphanage was gone. The infant gone. His hands trembled as he touched his own face, his uniform, the seat beneath him. He was real. He was alive. The radio crackled. "Unit 3 to 7, come in. Mercer? Are you there?" Daniel swallowed hard, reaching for the radio, with shaking fingers. "This is Mercer." A pause. "Where have you been?" He hesitated. What could he say? That he had just relived a past he had long since buried? That he had come face to face with the part of himself he had abandoned in the flames? That he had almost been taken back? Instead, he whispered the only thing that felt true. "Nowhere." Static filled the radio for a moment. Then, "Return to station. We have another abandoned child case." Daniel stiffened. His eyes flickered to the rear-view mirror. And for just a second, he swore he saw a child sitting in the back seat. Watching. Smiling. The radio crackled again. "Mercer?" He blinked. The seat was empty. With a slow, steady breath, he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. And without another word, he drove into the night. The end.